Linebacker. He had many wives, but only one true love. He was a mighty king of Egypt who ruled more than 3,000 years ago, but artifacts from his reign are on their way to Boston. In a moment, we'll take you on the search for Ramses the Great.
Ramses II, more commonly known as Ramses the Great, wasted little time in his 66-year reign in Egypt. He built scores of temples, monuments, and statues that remain standing today, 3,000 years later. And the pharaoh is thought to have sired almost 200 children in that same time period. Well, Dave, at least we know what killed him.
He was a remarkable individual, Chris. Now, you may remember the public response to the King Tut exhibit when it toured the country a few years back. I think that overwhelming would be a good word to describe it. But this May through August, there's going to be another Egyptian exhibition. This one is going to be larger. It's going to be of more historical importance than Tut's. It's coming to Boston's Museum of Science. Now, take a look at this. This mighty colossus, 25 feet tall, 57 tons, more than 3,000 years old, will be the exhibit centerpiece. It'll be housed in a special pyramid-like structure in front of the Boston Museum. Now, this statue is of Ramses II, Egypt's last great warrior pharaoh. It was lost for centuries, and then it was uncovered. That was back in 1962, and then it was restored for the Ramses the Great exhibit. And who really, though, was this mighty king that some claim was actually the pharaoh of the Exodus who lost to Moses and the Hebrews? Well, tonight, the first of 3 reports as I go in search of Ramses the Great. Egypt, a poor and some say ravaged country. Its people simple, their lives governed by a strong belief in Islam. This is a land forgotten by time, now a relic of her glorious past. But while the sun has long since set on this ancient empire, its proud history has survived the centuries. Ramses II was about 25 years old when his father died in the summer of 1279 BC. And soon after dawn in early June, he trembled with pride and anticipation as he heard the priest announce his formal accession to the throne of Egypt. He was not even of royal blood. However, as Pharaoh, Ramses the Great ruled Egypt for 67 years. And now, more than 3,000 years after his death, people clamor to be in his royal presence as his mummified remains are unveiled. Please pass. So who was this mighty king, Ramses II? During the early years of rediscovery, the debate between Egyptologists ranged from one extreme to the other. One noted that Ramses filled Egypt with luxuries and peace and prosperity. But another called him nothing more than an unbridled dictator who tormented his people and used them and strangers in his employs to fill his ambitions for war and in building. But we found that the truth about Ramses II lies somewhere in the middle.
He's a great PR man. Look at this. He's Egypt's greatest builder, not only in terms of number of monuments, but also in terms of size. Builds more monuments than anybody else in Egypt's history.
The mighty temples at Abu Simbel. One dedicated to his chief wife, Nefertari. The other he called the House of Ramses, beloved of the god Amun. When you speak of Ramses the Great, the essence of what he is bound up in this temple. And experts agree that this was his finest hour. And as you go further into the temple, you can see how his own idea of himself changes. At its beginning, he starts out as a mortal. At the end, he shows himself as a god. But what about those who toiled for decades to build these mighty monuments? Ramses' labor force broke down into 2 groups, the haves and have-nots. The latter, slave labor, rounded up by king command. Ramses wanted his temples built quickly and at minimal cost, so he seems to care little about his slave labor, but for his Egyptian workmen, it was a different matter. As thousands of slave laborers toiled under extremely harsh and difficult conditions in the building of the royal tombs, for the Egyptian workmen who lived in this village, it was a completely different story, because they were under the employ of the pharaoh. They lived comfortably and well.
However, the God King also visioned himself as a mighty warrior. So for those who served in his army, life could be years away from home, long duty marches, and bloody battles.
Now, you have to remember that as pharaoh, Ramses was all-powerful. He was the one who decided what would be recorded by the scribes about his reign. He also dictated what stories would be told on the temple walls. And he was a master at self-promotion, as you're going to see tomorrow night when we look at his military career. And by the way, the Ramses exhibition will feature more than 70 priceless treasures from the time of Ramses. It'll make its only northeast appearance at Boston Museum of Science. That's on April the 30th through to August the 30th. And it's quite a fascinating story.
Tickets are $8, correct?
$8, $6 for senior citizens.
Okay.
I understand it.
Thank you, Dave. Looking forward to more on your series tomorrow night. Okay.
Thanks. Catch. And then later, join me when Live at 5 goes to Egypt. Today, Ramses the Warrior. It's all ahead on Live at 5. Well, as I was mentioning last night, more than 500,000 people are expected to visit Boston's Museum of Science this spring and summer to view the exhibit of Ramses II, Egypt's last great warrior king, who, by the way, has been the subject of several movies. Example now, do you remember Cecil B. DeMille's epic, The Ten Commandments?
There is one more plague on Egypt. It is by your word that God will bring it.
Now, of course, that's Charlton Heston playing the part of Moses, of course, and Yul Brynner as Ramses II. However, Cecil B. DeMille aside, scholars are still debating whether or not Ramses II was indeed the pharaoh of the Exodus. However, later in the movie, remember now, we see Ramses in his chariot chasing the Israelites. And 3,000 years ago, this actually was the way Ramses wanted his people to visualize him as a great warrior leading his forces into battle. And that leads us into our second report as I go in search of Ramses the Great.
Modern Cairo, an overcrowded, bustling mass of humanity. A city of contrast caught in a time warp. The past ever present, its influence inescapable. Here, Ramses, the great pharaoh, 3,000 years after his death, still reigns. If Ramses' presence today is prominent, his visibility in ancient Egypt bordered on megalomania. In an age of primitive communications, the pharaoh was everywhere, his control unquestioned.
For a while each year, Ramses was going out on a campaign, so this kept the army pretty busy. And this was pretty traditional, actually, just to remind the people that he was strong and they'd better pay their tribute or else.
And with that tribute, Ramses set off on one of the great building binges of all time. Egypt is littered with what remains of the great monuments he built to himself.
But it would appear that he would prefer to be remembered as a warrior. Now, these engravings on this wall at Karnak Temple testify to the fact that he stakes his reputation as a warrior on just one major battle that he neither won or lost.
Early in his reign, young Ramses set out to recapture all of Egypt's former territories, which meant that he would have to face the mighty armies of the Hittite Empire. As he approached the city of Kadesh, he was fed false information by his intelligence officers, and he split his army into 3 groups. He himself camped just opposite the city with only his bodyguards at hand. Suddenly, the Hittite chariots appeared from ambush and smashed into the Egyptian ranks, and they were soon overwhelmed, and it appeared that all was lost. But Ramses, preferring death to dishonor, jumped into his chariot and rallied his troops, and this small group charged into the battle. The vicious counterattack confused the enemy long enough for the Egyptian support forces to arrive and save the day. In the days that followed, neither side advanced, and finally hostilities ended. Ramses returned home, gaining nothing but a reputation as a brave and mighty warrior.
He, of course, does paint himself as the great hero in the Battle of Kadesh, when in fact the battle was a stalemate. And he goes on and paints carves reliefs of this battle in temples throughout the land for 30 years after the battle takes place. So this is perhaps a bit of exaggeration on his part.
Exaggeration or not, Ramses tangled with his enemies made an indelible mark in history, and not simply because of his claim of victory.
Inscribed here on the walls of the Temple of Karnak is a most remarkable document. This is believed to be the first peace treaty in history. It was signed between the Egyptians and the Hittites, and it was blessed by the 1,000 gods of Egypt. And it worked because peace prospered in Ramses' Egypt.
There would be no more great military exploits for the remainder of Ramses' reign. His Egyptian empire, already in its twilight, would change little. This ancient civilization seemingly content to prosper quietly on the banks of the Nile.
Now, tomorrow night in our third report, we're going to take you into the tomb of Ramses' favorite queen, Nefertari. The tomb was opened especially for our group. And as you can see here, most of the wall paintings are as sharp and as colorful as they were when the tomb was built more than 3,000 years ago. An amazing adventure. By the way, Diana, trivia quickly. Going back to Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, who played the part of Nefertari? Do you remember?
I knew Yul Brynner, and I knew Charlton Heston.
Right.
No, who
and Baxter.
And
right, okay.
I should have known.
By the way, we should also mention that when the exhibit comes to Boston, you have to have advance tickets, so I would suggest that you contact the Boston Museum of Science for further information on that.
Those will go fast.
Yeah,
thanks,
indeed.
Dave. Look forward to part 3. That's Live at 5 for this Thursday, February 18th.
Tonight's Live at 5 trivia question. A famous actor will narrate the tapes that will guide, of course, the visitors through the Ramses exhibit here in Boston. Who do you think the actor is? The answer's coming up later on Live at 5, but Dave, here's a clue. The actor is going to probably take his check to the bank in a pair of chariots.
I'll give you one other clue, as a matter of fact, Chris. We mentioned him last night on Live at 5. Right now, though, TGIF, let's check on the traffic. When the great Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II was just 14 years old, his father made him Prince Regent. And with that came all the household, including a harem of more than 100 women, who he himself described as, and I'm quoting, comparable with the beauties of the palace, end quote. But later, as a young king, he only loved one. And that story in a moment.
Time now for the answer to our Live at 5 question. Which famous actor's voice will appear on the tapes guiding visitors through the Boston showing of Ramses the Great? Well, the answer is Charlton Heston, who, of course, played the part of Moses in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. Now, Dave, you couldn't ask for better casting, and you can't deny all that.
Right, Chris. You know, when you visit the Ramses exhibit at the Museum of Science, I think that you will agree that this Egyptian king that we're all talking about was a very complex individual. He declared himself a god, but he was also very careful never to belittle the other gods that his people worshipped. However, when it comes to honoring himself, Ramses took his cue from his predecessors to make sure that he was never second best.
When you arrive, it's not at all what you might expect. It's crowded, it's noisy, but people continue to come, and they come in droves.
The Great Pyramids of Giza. You know, this picture postcard scene you're looking at right now symbolizes for millions of people throughout the world everything that is Egyptian. And every year, hundreds of thousands of tourists visit the site to wonder at these structures, as did one of the greatest pharaohs of all time, Ramses II, more than 3,000 years ago.
In fact, the pyramids themselves were already over 1,000 years old when Ramses first saw them in the 12th century BC. Massive structures that boggled the mind. Even today, still considered engineering marvels. The largest contains over 2 million stone blocks. Thousands of workmen toiled upwards to 20 years to complete these ancient wonders.
Mainly, they are about 8 pyramids. All this type of pyramids are tombs for the king to be buried inside. To know the function, you have to study the archaeological artifacts that's found within the pyramid complex, as well as the inscriptions that's written inside all these tombs.
Inscriptions that would detail their life story as the deceased royal would like it told. And Ramses himself, who did everything in a big way, was not to be outdone by the ancients who preceded him.
With his harem and royal marriages, Ramses, of course, had hundreds of women in his lifetime. But apparently, at least by our standards, only one true love. And that was Chief Queen Nefertari. This is her tomb. It's one of the finest in all of the Valley of the Queens.
Nefertari's tomb, with its richly colored wall drawings, depicts her prominence with the gods and also the high esteem in which her mighty husband held her. But Ramses' devotion to his queen is perhaps best evidenced by the great temple he built for her at Abu Simbel, a tribute to his great love for Nefertari, a love that carried on through the generations.
When Nefertari dies, he marries her daughter. He married his sister, for instance. He had at least 8 great royal wives and probably a good number of lesser wives as well.
It's believed that Ramses ruled for another 30 years after Nefertari's death. Seemingly, he was content to rule quietly, and Egypt flourished during the remainder of his time. While the centuries since have not treated Egypt kindly, the legacy of Ramses the Great lives on. In an ancient religious text, a deceased king asked the creator God, "What is my duration of life?" And the deity replies, "Thou art destined for millions of years, a lifetime of millions."
Now, once again, I would remind you that the Ramses the Great exhibition at the Boston Museum of Science will run from April the 30th through to August the 30th. Now, it is going to be very risky to rely on securing tickets on a walk-in basis. Advance purchase is recommended, as tens of thousands of tickets have already been sold, including Charlton Heston. He bought some too, by the way, Diana.
Oh.
And you can contact the Museum of Science box office for further information on tickets. They're open 7 days a week, which means you can contact them tomorrow or Sunday. And then when the exhibition arrives, we'll have a lot more to show you on Live at 5.
So your series is going to continue because these 3 parts have been very fascinating.
Well, thank you. The one thing that they did do, the Cairo Museum officials were kind enough to open the mummy room for us. And very few people get into that, and in there is the mummy of Ramses' father.
And you're going to explain that whole process.
I'm not, but we have an
expert.
We have an expert to tell us about the mummification. It's fascinating.
Which is fascinating. The whole, that civilization, that time is really interesting.
It's
really
a beautiful country, beautiful country.
And you had a good trip.
Yes, I
and
did.
Also beautiful photography. We should also thank Bill Barrier.
Isn't that the truth? Without the cameramen, you're nothing.
That's it for Live at 5 this Friday, the 19th of February. Hope you have a good weekend. I'm Dinah Williams.
And I'm Dave Wright. Right now, though, it's over to R.D. Soul and Kate Sullivan for the New England News at 6.
Dukakis makes his plea for auto insurance reform and later an Egyptian odyssey, and a look at the life and times of the Pharaoh Ramses. Dr. Michael Gillen begins a series of reports a little later on News Center 5 at 6.